There are places on Earth that seem to exist beyond the ordinary world. Places where distance loses meaning, where horizons vanish into light, and where the boundary between sky and land simply disappears. High upon the Bolivian Altiplano, more than 3,600 meters above sea level, lies one of those rare landscapes. Salar de Uyuni. At first glance, it appears as an endless ocean turned to stone, a vast white expanse stretching farther than the eye can follow. In the dry season, the surface glitters beneath the sun like a frozen sea of crystal. During the rains, a thin layer of water transforms the salt into a mirror so perfect that clouds drift beneath your feet and mountains float upside down in the distance. Volcanic peaks stand silently on the horizon. The wind moves across the empty plains, and silence itself becomes part of the landscape. To stand here is to stand between earth and sky, between geology and myth, between the memory of ancient oceans and the future of a changing world. This is Salar de Uyuni, one of the most extraordinary places on our planet. The story of Srivijaya begins on the island of Sumatra, in a landscape where rivers move like veins through the forest and open toward the sea. Its early heart was around Palembang, near the Musi River, a place where inland resources and ocean routes could meet. This was not an accidental location. It was a doorway. From the interior came forest products, gold, resins, aromatic woods, and other valuable goods. From the sea came merchants, monks, envoys, sailors, and foreign ships waiting for the right winds. Palembang stood between these two worlds. It could gather wealth from the land and send it outward across the water. It could welcome ships from distant kingdoms, while drawing strength from the river systems behind it. In the ancient world, a river mouth could be as powerful as a fortress. It gave rulers access to trade, food, people, and communication. It allowed them to move boats inland and control what passed between the forest and the ocean. Srivijaya's early leaders understood this advantage. They were not isolated chiefs ruling a small settlement. They were positioned at a strategic meeting point where geography itself invited expansion. The earliest clear traces of Srivijaya appear in the 7th century, when inscriptions begin to reveal the presence of a rising power in southern Sumatra. These inscriptions do not give us a complete history. They are fragments, carved pieces of a much larger story. But they show that Srivijaya was already organizing authority, loyalty, religious merit, and political ambition. Behind the stone words was a kingdom learning how to command people and movement. This early Srivijaya was not yet the vast maritime power it would become. It had to grow. It had to secure its base, control nearby routes, and build relationships with surrounding communities. Its strength came from a combination of force, diplomacy, trade, and sacred authority. Rulers could reward loyalty, punish rebellion, attract merchants, support religious life, and present themselves as protectors of order in a dangerous maritime world. But Srivijaya's greatest advantage was vision. Many kingdoms looked inward toward fields, temples, and armies. Srivijaya looked outward toward the water. Its leaders understood that the sea was not a border. It was an opportunity. Every passing ship represented wealth. Every harbor represented influence. Every river mouth represented a point of control. If these points could be connected, a new kind of empire could emerge. From Sumatra, Srivijaya began to extend its reach across the surrounding waters. It did not need to occupy every island completely. It needed to control the routes that mattered. It needed ports that obeyed its authority, sailors who served its interests, and local rulers who recognized its dominance. Slowly, a regional power began to transform into a maritime network. The rise of Srivijaya was therefore not a sudden miracle. It was a result of geography, timing, and strategy. The world around it was hungry for trade. India and China were connected increasingly by sea. Merchants needed protection. Monks needed passage. Foreign courts needed reliable partners. Srivijaya offered all of this from one of the best positions in Southeast Asia. What began near the rivers of Sumatra would soon reach far beyond them. Srivijaya was no longer just a kingdom beside the water. It was becoming an empire of the sea and distant horizons. If Srivijaya had a throne, it was not carved from stone. It was the Strait of Malacca, this narrow waterway, stretching between the Malay Peninsula and the island of Sumatra, was one of the most important passages in the ancient world. To the west lay the Indian Ocean, with its routes to India, Arabia, and beyond. To the east lay the South China Sea, leading toward China and the wider Pacific world. Between them was a corridor of water that ships could not easily ignore. For merchants, the strait was a shortcut. For sailors, it was a challenge. For rulers, it was a prize. Any ship carrying goods between India and China often had to pass through this region. Spices, silk, ceramics, metals, incense, textiles, religious texts, and diplomatic gifts moved across these waters. The strait was not only a route of trade. It was a route of civilization. Wealth passed through it. Ideas passed through it. Power passed through it. Srivijaya rose because it understood the value of this passage. From its base in Sumatra, Srivijaya could watch the western approaches to the archipelago. It could influence the river mouths, ports, and coastal settlements that served ships moving through the strait. Control did not always mean blocking the sea with warships. Often, it meant something more subtle, offering safety, supplies, and order while making sure that merchants recognized Srivijayan authority. A trading ship in the ancient world needed more than open water. It needed harbors where crews could rest, take on fresh water, repair damage, sell goods, and wait for the next monsoon wind. Srivijaya's ports provided these services, but they also turned them into power. The empire could collect duties, guide trade, control access, and strengthen its prestige through every vessel that stopped in its waters. The Strait of Malacca gave Srivijaya a strategic advantage that land empires could only envy. A kingdom with fertile fields might feed armies. A kingdom with mountains might control mines. But a kingdom that controlled a maritime choke point could influence the movement of entire regions. It could become the gatekeeper between worlds. This was the secret of Srivijaya's strength. It did not need to produce every valuable product itself. It needed to stand where valuable products moved. It did not need to conquer India or China. It needed to connect them. It did not need to rule every island directly. It needed to control the channels through which ships, merchants, and messages passed. But the strait was also dangerous. Narrow waterways could attract raiders and pirates. Rival chiefs could challenge control over ports. Storms, reefs, and shifting currents could threaten ships. In this environment, authority mattered. Merchants preferred routes where protection was reliable and rules were understood. Srivijaya presented itself as the power that could provide that order. Over time, this gave the empire more than wealth. It gave it legitimacy. Foreign merchants came to its ports. Diplomats recognized its importance. Chinese courts received missions from Srivijaya. Buddhist monks traveled through its maritime network. Every relationship strengthened the image of Srivijaya as a necessary power in the seaborne world. To control a choke point was to control time itself. Ships could be delayed, guided, taxed, protected, or redirected. Information could be gathered before it reached rivals. In an age when distance was dangerous, Srivijaya quietly made distance manageable for those who respected its power. The strait also allowed Srivijaya to project influence in multiple directions. Westward, it connected with India and the Bay of Bengal. Eastward, it connected with Java, Borneo, and China. Northward, it touched the Malay Peninsula. Southward, it remained anchored in Sumatra. Srivijaya was therefore not trapped in one direction. It sat at the crossroads, able to look toward every horizon. This is why the Strait of Malacca was more than a body of water. It was Srivijaya's lifeline, shield, marketplace, and weapon. Whoever passed through it entered a world shaped by Srivijayan power. For centuries, this mastery made Srivijaya one of the great maritime forces of Asia. Its empire was not drawn only on land. It was drawn across waves, ports, and sea lanes. And as long as ships needed the strait, Srivijaya remained difficult to ignore. The wealth of Srivijaya did not come from a single mine, a single crop, or a single conquered land. It came from movement. Across the seas of Southeast Asia, goods traveled like messages between civilizations. From the forests and islands of the region came camphor, sandalwood, resins, aromatic woods, spices, gold, and rare natural products valued in distant markets. From India came cotton textiles, beads, metal goods, religious objects, and ideas shaped by centuries of contact across the Indian Ocean. From China came silk, ceramics, lacquerware, and refined luxury goods sought by rulers and merchants far beyond East Asia. Srivijaya stood in the middle of this exchange. Its ports were not quiet fishing villages. They were crowded meeting places where cargo changed hands. Officials collected duties. Sailors repaired ships, and merchants waited for favorable winds. A ship might arrive carrying Chinese ceramics and leave with forest products from Sumatra. Another might bring Indian textiles and depart with spices from the islands farther east. Goods did not always travel in one straight journey. They moved through stages from island to island, port to port, merchant to merchant. This system made Srivijaya powerful because it did not need to own everything that passed through its markets. It needed to control the places where exchange happened. By managing ports and sea lanes, Srivijaya could profit from the flow of goods produced across many lands. The empire became wealthy not simply by producing, but by positioning itself between producers and buyers. In the ancient world, spices were more than flavor. They were symbols of distance, luxury, and status. Aromatic woods and resins were used in ritual, medicine, perfume, and royal display. Camphor was treasured across Asia. Gold carried political and religious meaning. Ceramics and silk showed refinement and prestige. Every object that passed through Srivijaya's ports carried more than economic value. It carried desire, and desire created power. A ruler who could bring rare goods into his ports could attract merchants. A port that attracted merchants could collect taxes. Taxes could support officials, ships, religious foundations, and alliances. Alliances could secure more routes. More routes brought more merchants. Srivijaya's wealth was therefore circular. Trade strengthened the state, and the state protected trade. But this system required organization. Merchants needed predictable rules. Foreign visitors needed interpreters and brokers. Ships needed storage, repairs, water, and security. Local rulers needed to keep river routes open and coastal settlements loyal. Srivijaya's success came from turning these practical needs into imperial authority. It made itself useful, and by becoming useful, it became necessary. The empire also benefited from timing. As maritime trade between India and China grew, the demand for safe ports increased. Overland routes could be long and uncertain, but the sea offered another path, guided by monsoon winds and coastal networks. Srivijaya placed itself where that sea path narrowed and where ships naturally needed to stop. Its ports became places of waiting. Ships waited for winds. Merchants waited for buyers. Monks waited for passage. Officials waited for tribute. In that waiting, wealth gathered. This is why Srivijaya's power cannot be understood only by looking for palaces or battlefield victories. Its true monument was the movement of ships. Its treasury was the sea lane. Its empire was carried in cargo holds filled with spices, silk, camphor, sandalwood, gold, ivory, ceramics, and sacred objects. Srivijaya turned geography into revenue and trade into authority. It mastered one of history's oldest truths. The richest empire is not always the one that owns the goods. Sometimes, it is the one that controls where the goods must pass before reaching the wider world. Srivijaya was more than a stop between India and China. It was a bridge that made the long maritime journey possible. In the ancient world, India and China were two immense centers of civilization. India was a source of religious traditions, philosophical ideas, mathematics, medicine, textiles, and artistic influence. China was a center of imperial power, silk production, ceramics, writing, bureaucracy, and luxury trade. Between these worlds stretched mountains, deserts, forests, and seas. Overland routes existed, but they were difficult, expensive, and often dangerous. The sea offered another path. Srivijaya stood along that path. Ships leaving the Indian subcontinent crossed the Bay of Bengal and entered the waters of Southeast Asia. From there, they could move toward the Malay Peninsula, Sumatra, Java, and eventually the South China Sea. Ships from China sailed southward into the same maritime world. At the meeting point of these routes, Srivijaya became a place where two great civilizations could encounter one another without directly touching. Its ports became zones of translation, not only of language, but of culture. A merchant from India could exchange goods with a local broker who understood the needs of Chinese markets. A Chinese envoy could meet representatives of a kingdom shaped partly by Indian religious and political ideas. A monk could arrive from China, study in Srivijaya, and then continue toward India. The empire turned distance into connection. This connection was not simple. It was layered. Goods moved through Srivijaya, but so did people. Merchants brought information about prices, routes, rulers, and dangers. Sailors carried stories from distant ports. Monks brought sacred texts and ritual knowledge. Diplomats carried letters and gifts. With every ship, Srivijaya gained not only wealth, but awareness of the wider world. Language itself became part of the empire's power. In the markets and ports, many tongues could be heard. Local Malay languages, Sanskrit terms from religious and political life, Chinese speech, Tamil, and other languages of trade. Srivijaya did not erase these voices. It benefited from them. A successful maritime empire had to understand difference. It had to make foreigners feel that they could trade, pray, negotiate, and survive within its world. Through India, Srivijaya absorbed religious and cultural influences, especially Buddhism and elements of Sanskrit political vocabulary. Through China, it gained diplomatic recognition and access to one of the greatest markets in the world. But Srivijaya was not merely a passive receiver. It selected, adapted, and transformed outside influences into something local and powerful. It was Southeast Asian, maritime, and cosmopolitan at the same time. This is what made Srivijaya unique. It did not become important by standing apart from the world. It became important by standing between worlds. For India, Srivijaya was a partner across the sea. For China, it was a gateway to the Southern Ocean. For merchants, it was a necessary stop. For monks, it was a place of learning and preparation. For local rulers, it was a force that could bring prestige, wealth, and danger. In Srivijaya's harbors, civilization did not move in one direction. It flowed both ways. Indian ideas traveled east. Chinese goods traveled west. Southeast Asian products entered global markets. Local cultures reshaped everything they received. The empire was not only a bridge of trade. It was a bridge of worlds held together by ships, winds, and ambition. Srivijaya was built on trade, but its power was not measured only in gold, spices, and ships. It was also measured in knowledge. In the ports of this maritime empire, commerce and religion moved side by side. A vessel entering Srivijayan waters might carry silk, ceramics, or camphor, but it might also carry monks, manuscripts, sacred images, and questions about the nature of existence. The same sea lanes that brought wealth also carried ideas. In Srivijaya, the marketplace and the monastery belonged to the same connected world. By the 7th century, Srivijaya had become an important Buddhist center in Southeast Asia. Its rulers supported religious life not only as an act of devotion, but also as a way to strengthen prestige. In the ancient world, a kingdom associated with sacred learning could gain respect beyond its borders. Monks, scholars, and pilgrims gave a realm a different kind of authority, one that could not be counted only in taxes or ships. One of the most important witnesses to this world was a Chinese monk Yijing. He traveled by sea from China toward India, seeking Buddhist knowledge at its source. But before reaching India, he stopped in Srivijaya. What he found was not a remote outpost at the edge of civilization. He found a place where Buddhist study was serious and respected. Yijing's experience gives us a rare glimpse into Srivijaya's spiritual importance. He described it as a place where monks could study and prepare before continuing to India. This was significant. India remained a great homeland of Buddhism and a location of centers of learning, but Srivijaya served as a gateway. It was a station of preparation, translation, discipline, and intellectual exchange. For a monk traveling across the ocean, Srivijaya was more than a port. It was a classroom. There, a traveler could adjust to the world of South and Southeast Asian Buddhism. He could learn languages, study texts, meet teachers, and prepare for the longer journey westward. In this sense, Srivijaya did not simply connect goods between India and China. It connected minds. It helped create a chain of learning across the sea. This made the empire cosmopolitan. Its Buddhist culture was shaped by contact with India, but it developed within a Southeast Asian maritime setting. Monks from different regions could meet in its ports. Religious ideas could be translated, discussed, copied, and carried onward. Sacred texts moved like cargo, but their value was not material. They changed how people understood the world. Srivijaya's role as a Buddhist center also strengthened its political image. A ruler who supported Buddhism could present himself as more than controller of trade. He could appear as a protector of moral order, a supporter of learning, and a patron of sacred merit. Religious patronage helped bind together a maritime empire whose territories and allies were scattered across water. This was especially important because Srivijaya was not a simple land empire with one continuous territory. Its power depended on networks. Buddhism offers shared language of prestige, ritual, and legitimacy that could travel across those networks. A monastery, a teacher, or a sacred image could help connect distant places to the authority of the center. In Srivijaya, therefore, the sea did not only carry merchants. It carried devotion. It carried discipline. It carried memory. The empire became a meeting point between the material and the spiritual. Ships brought wealth, but monks brought meaning. Ports collected taxes, but monasteries collected knowledge. Rulers guarded sea lanes, but they also guarded their reputation as patrons of a sacred tradition. This is why Srivijaya cannot be understood only as a trade empire. Its greatness was larger than commerce. It was part of the Buddhist world, part of the intellectual history of Asia, and part of the long movement of ideas between India, China, and Southeast Asia. For a time, the empire of ships also became an empire of learning. Srivijaya was not ruled like many famous land empires. It was not defined by one continuous border, one massive wall, or one road system stretching across a continent. Its power was more fluid. It moved with ships, ports, rivers, alliances, and sea lanes. To understand Srivijaya, we must stop imagining empire only as territory colored on a map. A maritime empire worked differently. Its strength came from controlling points of movement, a river mouth, a harbor, a narrow strait, a coastal settlement, a chain of loyal ports. These places were like knots in a net. Whoever held the knots could shape the movement of everything passing through them. Srivijaya's rulers did not need to place soldiers on every beach or govern every island directly. Instead, they built a network of influence. Some regions may have been under direct control. Others may have been tributary partners, local allies, dependent ports, or communities tied to Srivijaya through trade, marriage, religion, obligation, or fear. Power was negotiated, reinforced, and displayed through relationships. Tribute was one of the tools of the system. Local rulers could send goods, recognize Srivijayan superiority, and receive protection or prestige in return. Diplomacy also mattered. Missions to foreign courts, especially China, helped present Srivijaya as a legitimate and important kingdom. Recognition from powerful outsiders strengthened authority at home and across the sea. Naval power was another foundation. Even if Srivijaya did not leave behind detailed descriptions of its fleets, its dominance depended on the ability to secure waterways. Ships could protect trade, intimidate rivals, move officials, and respond to threats. In a maritime world, the Navy was not only a military force, it was the arm of government. Ports were the empire's administrative centers. There, officials could collect duties, regulate merchants, supervise storage, settle disputes, and monitor foreign visitors. Control of trade meant control of information. A port ruler could learn who was sailing where, what goods were valuable, which kingdoms were rising, and which rivals were becoming dangerous. Religion also supported rule. Buddhist patronage gave Srivijaya moral prestige and helped connect distant communities through shared sacred culture. In a scattered empire, ideas could bind where roads could not. This made Srivijaya flexible, but also vulnerable. A land empire might survive by holding territory. A maritime empire survived by keeping networks loyal and routes active. If ports rebelled, trade shifted, or foreign attacks broke the chain of control, power could weaken quickly. Srivijaya's rule was therefore a balance of wealth, movement, fear, diplomacy, and belief. It was not an empire of fixed lines. Its borders were felt less on land than in the choices sailors made before entering its nearby waters and harbors. It was an empire of connections. No empire built on movement can remain still forever. For centuries, Srivijaya had mastered the sea lanes of Southeast Asia. Its power depended on ports, alliances, tribute, religious prestige, and the control of maritime passages. But the very system that made it strong also made it vulnerable. If the routes shifted, if allies broke away, if rivals challenged the ports, the empire's strength could begin to unravel. Srivijaya did not fall in a single moment. Its decline was a slow weakening, shaped by pressure from many directions. Rival powers were always watching the same waters. Java, the Malay Peninsula, Cambodia, and other coastal kingdoms all had interests in trade and prestige. No maritime route belonged permanently to one ruler. Every harbor could become a prize. Every local chief could become an ally today and a threat tomorrow. Srivijaya had to constantly maintain loyalty across a scattered network, and that required wealth, diplomacy, and force. As long as trade flowed through its ports, Srivijaya could reward supporters and intimidate rivals. But when competition grew, the balance became harder to maintain. Other ports could attract merchants. Other rulers could promise protection. Other kingdoms could rise along the same sea lanes. A maritime empire was powerful only as long as ships continued to choose its network. Then came one of the most dramatic blows in Srivijaya's history, the Chola raids from South India in the 11th century. The Chola dynasty was a powerful South Indian kingdom with its own ambitions across the Indian Ocean. Its rulers understood maritime trade and naval strength. In the early 11th century, Chola forces launched attacks against Srivijayan centers and allied ports. These raids struck at the heart of Srivijaya's power, not by conquering every part of the empire permanently, but by damaging the network that held it together. For a land empire, losing a city could be a disaster. For a maritime empire, losing control of key ports could be even worse. Ports were not just settlements. They were revenue points, symbols of authority, diplomatic gateways, and links in the chain of trade. When those links were broken, confidence could collapse. The Chola attacks showed that Srivijaya was no longer untouchable. Merchants noticed weakness. Local rulers noticed weakness. Rivals notice weakness. Once the image of invincibility is damaged, a network empire can begin to fragment. Ports that once obeyed may seek independence. Allies may look elsewhere. Trade may redirect towards safer or more profitable harbors. But external attacks were only part of the story. The wider maritime world was changing. Trade routes were never fixed forever. Economic centers shifted. New ports grew. Political power moved. In some periods, the center of Srivijayan influence may have shifted from Palembang toward Jambi and other areas. This suggests not simple destruction, but transformation and fragmentation. The empire faded because its foundations were dynamic. The sea that carried its wealth could also carry its rivals. The winds that brought merchants to its ports could bring them somewhere else. The straits that made it powerful could become contested corridors. Srivijaya had built an empire of connections, and connections can be broken. Its decline also reminds us that power in Southeast Asia was not always about total conquest. A kingdom could lose dominance gradually. It could survive in name, memory, or reduced influence while no longer commanding the same authority. Srivijaya's fall was not the collapse of a stone wall. It was the loosening of a net. By the 13th century, new powers were rising. The political landscape of the region was changing. The old maritime order that had made Srivijaya great was giving way to new forces, new ports, and new ambitions. Eventually, the empire that had once controlled the crossroads of the sea slipped from dominance into memory. Yet there is something tragic about its decline. Srivijaya had not been weak. It had mastered geography, trade, religion, and diplomacy for centuries. But history does not preserve power simply because it was once brilliant. Empires must continue to adapt, and Srivijaya's world changed faster than its network could hold. The sea had given Srivijaya everything. In the end, the sea carried its power away, toward new horizons beyond its old command forever. Srivijaya disappeared from power, but it did not disappear from history. Its ships no longer command the Strait of Malacca. Its ports no longer receive tribute from distant rulers. Its name does not echo through popular memory like Rome, Egypt, or China. Yet the influence of Srivijaya remains beneath the surface of Southeast Asian history, like an old current still moving under the sea. Its first legacy was maritime. Srivijaya proved that power in Southeast Asia could be built not only on land, but on water. It showed that ports, sea lanes, river mouths, and straits could form the backbone of an empire. Later kingdoms and trading cities would inherit this lesson. Control of movement could be as important as control of territory. Its second legacy was commercial. Srivijaya helped shape the ancient trade networks that connected India, China, and the island worlds of Southeast Asia. Through its ports passed goods that linked forests, islands, courts, temples, and markets across thousands of kilometers. The empire reminds us that globalization did not begin in the modern age. Long before modern shipping, ancient sailors were already connecting distant societies. Its third legacy was religious and intellectual. Srivijaya became part of the Buddhist world, a place where monks could study, prepare, and travel onward. It helped carry Buddhist ideas across the maritime routes of Asia. In its harbors, sacred texts and commercial cargo moved side by side. This made Srivijaya not only a center of exchange, but a center of learning. Its fourth legacy was cultural. As a Malay maritime power, Srivijaya helped shape the wider Malay world. Its use of Old Malay inscriptions, its political language, and its maritime networks contributed to patterns of culture and authority that would continue long after the empire weakened. It stood near the roots of a regional identity formed by rivers, coasts, trade, and shared movement across the sea. But perhaps Srivijaya's most powerful legacy is the lesson of memory. Why do some empires become famous while others fade? Why do stone monuments survive in imagination more easily than ships, ports, and wooden cities? Srivijaya ruled a world of water, and water does not preserve memory the way stone does. Much of its greatness had to be reconstructed from fragments. Inscriptions, foreign records, archaeological discoveries, and scattered traces of art. That makes its story feel ghost-like. Srivijaya was once a master of the sea, a guardian of the Strait of Malacca, a bridge between India and China, a Buddhist center, and a force that shaped the movement of wealth and belief across Asia. Then, slowly, it vanished from everyday remembrance. Yet forgetting is not the same as insignificance. The empire may have faded, but the world it helped create continued. Ships still passed through the Strait of Malacca. Maritime trade remained central to Southeast Asia. Religious and cultural connections endured. Srivijaya became silent, but its influence kept moving. Like the sea itself, it left no simple monument. It left a current, and that current changed history.